the planet.
Fantasy and science fiction, when I began writing, were, particularly in America, strictly genre. The magazines were pulp magazines. It had no respect from the critics.
What Ursula was having to navigate was the societal prejudices against science fiction, against the fantastic, and against children's fiction. All of these things were marginalized.
People would think ray guns and silly things. This can't be serious.
A genre label can be a very useful tool for a critic who wants to dismiss a writer or not take a writer seriously.
The critics had dismissed science fiction and fantasy as essentially worthless, and I knew better. I knew that my work was not second-rate, that it was of literary value.
I'd like this not to be resigned, but to be rebellious. I want to see science fiction step over the old walls and head right into the next wall and start to break it down, too.
Imaginative fiction trains people to be aware that there are other ways to do things and other ways to be, that there is not just one civilization and it is good and it is the way we have to be. I think it trains the imagination.
Okay, we're almost there.
See?
Now you're going in the back door here.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Powells. Dear Powells. It's so nice always to come back here. There are an awful lot of books about writing here. And they tend to be very full of rules. Do this, don't do that. I don't talk about rules because I have come to believe that every story must make its own rules and obey them.
Ursula, she was going to be a writer. I mean, that's what she needed to do. That was what life was for her. We started at Radcliffe in the fall of 1947. Ursula had a kind of earthy manner of speech, which was very refreshing and not so common in that environment. She could also be a little frightening because there was this very sharp, keen mind and very strong feelings about what she cared about.
People always say, when did you decide you wanted to be a writer? And I never wanted to be a writer. I just wrote. It's what I did. It's the way my being was.
She didn't see herself as a science fiction writer. She wanted to write imaginatively about what interested her.
She worked on the literary magazine for a little while at Radcliffe, but they wouldn't publish any of her stuff. The important writers of the moment were very macho, very masculine. I think everyone was still under the influence of Hemingway. It was all realism, it was all male. And she went looking for a space that she could make her own. I think the first couple years in Portland, it was just, you know how it is when you have little kids. You really don't do much of anything else except the kids, but she managed to work all the time.
My mother was very disciplined about her writing schedule, so she would help us get out of the house in the morning, then write in the morning, then do housework in the afternoon.
She had her study,
and she would go in there and shut the door.
They knew not to bother Mama when she was working. I knew not to bother when she was working, too.
Charles would read it, and maybe my mother would read it, then I'd send it to the editor, and then the editor would reject it. I don't know how many times I was told I write well, but we don't know quite what you're doing. I was beginning to feel a little desperate. Like, if I can't publish anything except an occasional poem in a tiny, tiny poetry magazine, you know, what am I doing? Am I kidding myself? I did keep methodically sending them out. One of them got accepted by a pulp science fiction magazine, and they paid $30. Back then, that was really important to us. We were just getting by. It definitely encouraged me to look more seriously at fantasy and science fiction as a definition of the kind of thing I was writing, which was never really mainstream realism. There was always something a little off-key about it.
The more they sold, the more she wrote. She was kind of experimenting with interplanetary travel and world building. She turned out to be an excellent world builder.
My editor, Don Walheim, at Ace Books, was also the first person to publish Ursula's science fiction. Around 1965 or 66, I had come into the office at Ace Books, and Don said, "Oh, we're publishing a new writer. I think she's really very good." And he handed me Rocannon's World, which was her first novel.
Ursula's early work, it's fertile in detail. They are written by a young person with a young person's vivacity. And let's give this a go, and let's have some flying cats with big teeth.
I confess I was not blown away by them, but I did think, you know, something is going on here.
These early novels, they're still written from the perspective of kind of heroic men. That was what science fiction was like at the time, and Le Guin wasn't really stepping outside that quite yet. Even though they do have that flavor of kind of just action-adventure in space, you can already see her developing a lot of the themes that she becomes known for later on, where she has these truly alien characters, futures, and alternate worlds.
It's really well-realized stuff, and it's better than a lot of writers' best. But she was on quite a steep, near-vertical trajectory artistically.
I had written a couple of short stories that took place on these islands where there were wizards and dragons. In 1968, when the publisher of Parnassus Books came to me and said, "Would you write a young adult novel?" These islands grew and boom, this is a whole archipelago of islands, and now I draw the map. And I would name the rivers and the mountains and the cities, but I didn't know anything about them till I went there with my characters. As a boy, our hero was called Sparrowhawk, because the wild hawks would come when he called them. But his true secret name is Ged. Ged sails to Roke Island, the Isle of the Wise, hidden in the heart of the archipelago. From all over Earthsea, young men come to Roke to learn the art of magic, the craft of wizardry. This was not, at that time, a well-known concept, idea of a wizard school.
I don't think Harry Potter could have existed without Earthsea having existed. That was the original, the finest, and the best.
In winter, he was sent across Roke Island to the farthest northmost cape, where stands the Isolate Tower. There, by himself, lived the Master Namer, Curum Carmeruk,
sat on a high seat, writing down lists of names that must be learned before the ink faded at midnight, leaving the parchment blank again. He might say, "He who would be sea master must know the true name of every drop of water in the sea." Magic exists in most societies in one way or another. And one of the forms it exists in a lot of places is if you know a thing's true name, you have power over the thing or the person. And of course, it's irresistible because I'm a writer. I use words. And knowing the names of things I do magic. I do make up things that didn't exist before by naming them. I call it Earthsea. And there it is. It exists. So I had this total parallel between wizards and artists to play with.
I bought Wizard of Earthsea and I was in love. It felt right. The idea that naming things was magic.
I love how in Earthsea, the strongest magic is made of the same thing that the books are made of. It's words. If you are a proficiently gifted wizard, you can become a different kind of being. You can become a hawk or a fish. But be careful, if you stay there too long, you can't come back.
In a Wizard of Earthsea, Guin has to find out who he is. He's a kid with a tremendous gift, and he knows it. He knows he has a power that most people don't have. When you're young, you're kind of, nothing can kill you, nothing can really hurt you. You're going to get away with it, you know. He really thinks that way until he gets nearly killed by his own folly.
It's an internal evil. It's Ged's own worst self that becomes the evil presence in his life.
Well, a lot of kids go through something like that. And then they have to kind of struggle on and figure out, okay, I'm not quite who I thought I was. Who am I? How do I be a good person? Seems like a real simple question, but most of us spend our lives working at it. Because every time you think you found your way, the way changes. I start pretty much with place. And then the people grow up in the place. Our first trip out here in '68, I'd just never been in country like this, and it just knocked me over. All I knew was that I had to come back. It's about as far as I want to go. That is one big hole in the ground. So when the book did well, the publisher asked me for another one. I thought, I know what the next Earthsea story has to be. I needed a desert for the book. And the Kargish Islands looked as if they might have some deserts. It's a community of women only, isolated in the desert, no men. The Kargish people don't believe in magic. Instead, they worship the nameless ones, the old powers of the earth. Our main character is a young girl who was taken from her family as a baby to serve the powers of the tombs. She doesn't remember the name her mother gave her, Terramar. One of the places she alone can go is called the Undertomb, and it leads to the labyrinth. In the first book, darkness often implies evil. In the second book, darkness is an equal power with light. And the girl, Terramar, is the priestess of that great power. She went forward in the pitch dark, easy as a little fish in dark water. Down the slanting passage, a faint gray bloomed, the echo of a distant light. She halted, and then very slowly took the last step and looked and saw what she had never seen. The great vaulted cavern beneath the tombstones. The light burned at the end of a staff of wood, smokeless, unconsumed. She saw the face beside the light, the dark face, the face of a man. Terramar meets Ged in the undertomb. He knows what her real name is, and he can give it back to her. And that, in a sense, is what frees her, frees them both.
That's a very good, polite horse. That's a sweetie, yes it is.
I don't live in a dream world, a kind of woo-woo place at all. I think you can see that in my fantasy writing. I don't feel so much as if I were making it up. I know I am, but that isn't what it feels like. It feels like being there and looking around and listening. When you say, what's the name of that flower? Why do you want to know the name? What does it matter? Somehow it connects you to the flower. Even the scientists, they do have to name the species and the individuals and so on. A lot of people think that fantasy is just escapism and has nothing to do with the real world. And I don't feel that at all. Partly because my father was a scientist, an anthropologist, and I grew up with a profound respect for and liking for the way scientists' minds work.
Alfred Kroeber was the founder of academic anthropology in the early years of the University of California. Ursula K. Le Guin, and she always keeps the K for Kroeber, was a precocious faculty brat.
There were a lot of anthropologists around. It was, it's just shop talk, and I'm listening in. It was such a mixture of exciting minds and backgrounds. So I'm sure that did something to my head, something good.
Ursula was very much the youngest, the only girl, always trying to get a word in edgewise in this family. She really learned to debate and to argue and to hold her own in a way that was probably unusual for girls of her generation.
As soon as school and college were out, we packed up and drove the very long 60 miles up to the Napa Valley. It's 40 acres with an old ranch house on it. Those hills are very wild. You can feel like you're in the absolute wilderness. It was heaven for an introvert. My father would tell us Indian stories, translating in his head sometimes from the language that he'd learned them in. And of course, what my father spent years of his life doing was going around California, on foot, by horse, talking to survivors of destroyed peoples or almost destroyed peoples, trying to save what was left of their culture from the white tide. Just taking down what they would and could tell him, just writing it down.
It probably was the darkest chapter for all of Indian country. And I think anthropologists were on the forefront of what they saw was saving natives.
It was plausible to think we had better record these cultures and these languages because in a generation they wouldn't be there. Kroeber will always be identified with the best-known survivor of the decimated populations of native California, a man who came to be known as Ishi.
April 1914, Ishi.
In 1911, the last of his kin died, and Ishi walked south down toward Oroville. And the anthropologists in San Francisco heard about this wild man, who they thought must be perhaps the last really authentic, uncorrupted, unchanged California Indian.
Ishi's people were among those people who you don't tell a stranger your name. My father said, "What would you like us to call you?" And Ishi means man, male person. We don't know Ishi's name. We'll never know his name.
Ishi and Kroeber had a complex friendship. They respected each other, they liked each other, and in some ways they needed each other. But it was a friendship that was cross-cut by relations of power and authority. Ishi died in 1916 of tuberculosis, and it was very traumatic for Kroeber. There's, I think, no question about that.
I had not heard the name of Ishi when I was a child. That was a long ago chapter in my father's life, an unhappy one. So I just never heard about Ishi. Till all of a sudden, they were sort of saying, "Hey, Kroeber, you ought to write about, you're one of the last people who knew Ishi, and you knew him well. You ought to write it." He said, "I cannot do it. Ask my wife." My mother began to work on the story of Ishi and to live through, in her imagination, how Ishi not only survived in a terrible solitude for a while, but also then came alone into a strange world. My mother was not an anthropologist, but she was a very good writer.
The ultimate impact was to humanize Ishi the man, although somewhat romantic and certainly incomplete. Her book kept at least one version of that story alive.
My mother's book opened many people's eyes, including my own, to the appalling history of the white conquest of California. Some people are quick to see injustice and cruelty, but I was slow to see it. I had to put the pieces together myself, and it took a long time. It's kind of hard to admit that your people did something awful. When I absorb something like that, what I do with it, the way I handle it, is probably to put it into a novel. There were a lot of violent struggles about power and domination going on in the world, and so also in my novels. But I was more interested in exploring alternatives to violence and exploitation. And this is the basic purpose of the Ecumen, a peaceful consortium of worlds. The Ecumen was a device that let me send intelligent people all over the universe to find out interesting things.
This pan-galactic association of worlds is one of Ursula's great inventions. One of science fiction's great inventions as well, I think.
The Ecumen provides this huge laboratory in which the writer herself is the scientist who's conducting a kind of experiment, a thought experiment on human beings and humanity and their other ways of interacting with each other. So, like, what if we just change this one little thing and that little thing? What would happen? What would it be like?
I wrote a book back in the 60s called Left-Handed Darkness, where I was first asking myself, well, okay, what is the difference between men and women? And the means I used to talk about it was to invent a race of people who are androgynous, fully androgynous. You
only become sexually active once a month, and you may become active as a man or as a woman. You don't know which.
And so in the course of someone's lifetime, they can father a child, they can mother a child, they can have lovers of all different types.
In The Left Hand of Darkness, we meet Genli, the first envoy from the Ecumen to the planet of winter. As he tries to navigate this ice-bound world of genderless people, Genli becomes entangled in a political web. He's forced to flee across a glacier, along with Estraven, a native of winter who has become his ally.
As they cover the miles over the ice, they also close the miles between themselves as individuals, as different subspecies of Homo sapiens.
After all, he's no more an oddity, a sexual freak, than I am. Up here on the ice, each of us is singular, isolated. I as cut off from those like me, from my society and its rules, as he from his.
It's not just a geographical journey, it's a journey into human cooperation, into a human relationship.
When Left Hand of Darkness came out, it was perceived rightly as having changed things, as being a completely new work, as being something that was unlike anything else that had been published.
It was extremely popular, especially among young readers. Those were the readers that first, I think, were drawn to her.
Nowadays, there is a lot more interest in kind of gender queering and gender fluidity. I wonder if it might be difficult for a young reader now to realize quite how extraordinary and powerful that was when she did it.
She's like, what about this? What if this was the way it played out organically and everyone could just experience and see it? So that was a really formative book for me.
Readers and critics have thought about Left Hand of Darkness as a feminist novel, and I absolutely think it was for its time, but there were other writers, feminist science fiction writers, and critics as well, who were saying, you didn't quite go far enough.
She got in trouble with Left Hand of Darkness because when you weren't changing into some other gender, you were he.
It started getting criticism. Why are you forcing us to think of a masculine default all the way? Couldn't you have done it a different way? Do I think that the Left Hand of Darkness that Ursula would write now would be the Left Hand of Darkness that I read in 1971? No, obviously not. She has changed and the world has changed.
At first, I felt a little bit defensive, but as I thought about it, I began to see my critics were right. I was coming up against how I could write about gender equality. Just because you've written a book about something doesn't mean you're done thinking about it. There's always room to keep expanding your ideas, keep learning. My job is not to arrive at a final answer and just deliver it. I see my job as holding doors open or opening windows, but who comes in and out the doors? What you see out the window? How do I know?
There you go. Let me turn the bell.
Ursula Guin, she doesn't set herself up as a giver of answers, but she is one of the very finest explorers of questions.
Let's get ready. We're going to start right away, okay?
There's a story by Ursula called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which begins as a thought experiment. She tells you that she is going to describe an imaginary place, an imaginary city, and also tells you that she's going to work with you and your imagination to make it the most wonderful city you have ever imagined or experienced. you are part of this. You are creating this with her. And you experience for several pages this wonderful city of noble people, the city of cities, Omelas. And then she says, and there's one more thing. Somewhere in this city, there is a cellar with a child in it who is being mistreated horribly. And the joy of all of the people depends on this one child being forced to suffer, degraded, abused, and that everybody in the city knows it.
The terms are strict and absolute. There may not even be a kind word spoken to the child. The instant the child is let out, the city is gone. They're not naive, they're not stupid, right? The joy is real. The city is righteous, but it also relies on the suffering, right? And so that's
So basically, their happiness comes from somebody else's misery.
Yes. And it's just one person, just one child.
Right.
An entire city. Like, they don't even need government, they don't need religious institutions, they don't really need laws, they don't need weapons, they don't need war. You know what I mean? It's like, it's kind of a utopia, right? But it's not a utopia.
And it sets out and it says, this is a thought experiment. And then it goes in and it breaks your heart. And it leaves you with a world that is changed. It leaves you shaken if you read it right.
It made me feel really upset that this child was being so mistreated because he was, or she was, the price of happiness for the entire town.
This moral dilemma was really compelling to me because it was impossible to pick out like what the right course of action would be. Like, there was nothing that would be completely morally right.
This child is seen. And some of them go back to their lives. And then there are the ones who walk away from Omelas.
I would try and help the child. I really would not care if it would disrupt the whole nature of the city because it's a young child, like barely holding on. So I would do anything to help the child.
I think I would forget about the child. I would be one of the people who stays in the town and like puts it in the back of my mind and continues to live happily and peacefully because I have the privilege to do that.
I would walk away. I think the ones who walk away, they can reflect on this kid again and again and know that they're not a part of it and they're not like supporting it. And maybe they make their own home that everything's perfect.
In Omelas, I was setting up a question about where they might be going, the ones who walk away from injustice. And in my novel, The Dispossessed, I wanted to go deeper into that question. This was the late 60s. People were asking, what might a perfect society look like? A society that was not based on oppression. And thinking about that question brought me to nonviolent anarchism. I think anarchist thinking is one of those profoundly radical ways of thinking that is very fruitful, very generative. The more I read in anarchism, the more I realized that it was the only major political theory that hadn't had a utopia written about it. And I thought, well, that would be fun. That would be cool, you know. Then I could kind of begin figuring out what would a genuine working anarchist society be like. In The Dispossessed, a revolutionary group has abandoned their capitalist, Earth-like world to create a just and free society on their moon, with no gender dominance, no coercive government, no private ownership.
I think The Dispossessed gives us a chance to experience what it would be like to live outside of capitalism. It reminds us that the way we live right now is not the only possible way for humans to live. At first, we're drawn to this anarchist society, but we can see the flaws that keep the individual from being entirely free. I think it's a foundational book. Like any organizer I ever meet, I'm like, you have to read this book. This is what we're trying to figure out.
It's a flawed utopia. It's messy. The crooked timber of humanity is still crooked there.
I knew from the start that it contained its own betrayal. No human society can just find perfection and sit there. That's not how things work.
Certainly, The Dispossessed has this political foundation about inequality, about class, about hierarchy. But if you just want that, then a political tract will do the job. I'd read a lot of science fiction, the good, the bad, and the ugly, but I've never seen the form use that intelligently, that artfully.
In the span of just a few years, we see Ursula release this torrent of major novels back to back, each more original than the last. She's pushing the boundaries of what science fiction could do. She takes the whole scene by storm.
I won both prizes in science fiction and got a good deal of notice. I was up on a whole other level at that point, which was very nice because I was by then well in my 30s and kind of like, it's time I was getting somewhere. And as it happened, I was hitting my stride at a very interesting moment for science fiction.
Science fiction has always been a very strange ragtag area of literature, with tension between what gets called hard science fiction, which is nuts and bolts, and soft science fiction, and in which the fiction part is the most important part. In the 30s and the 40s, it was basically nuts and bolts.
There was an older generation of science fiction that was sort of led by people like Heinlein and Asimov.
They were expanding the public's understanding of what spaceflight might be like. They were championing science at a time when people were not always sure that science was a cool thing. But they were not super aware of how culture worked beyond a very narrow perspective, which was their perspective as white guys, many of whom had been scientists.
And then there was us, who were kind of being a little bit uppity, who were willing to kind of change the terms. A bunch of young Turks, we sort of came in and shook it up.
You have people like Samuel Delany, Ursula K, Guin, Joanna Russ, women who are writing, people of color, and they have different stories to tell, but also specifically bringing in areas of scientific and cultural inquiry that hadn't really been the purview of science fiction before.
It's during that period that she was starting to do conferences and a lot of science fiction related to public speaking. She really began to move into herself, to own herself as someone who has a voice and the authority that goes with that voice and the right to use it.
It was a ball. It was a very small world. And when we had a meeting, most of us came. And everybody was intensely interested in what we were doing, you know. And a lot of us were quite young. So those meetings were very lively.
I remember she used to smoke a pipe, and I thought that was great.
There was an opening out. She was putting herself into conversation with other writers.
I think it would make sense if I went on and spoke as what I am, a writer of science fiction, a woman writer of science fiction. You know, I am a very rare creature. My species was at first believed to be mythological, like the tribble and the unicorn.
I'd been a bit of a lone wolf. And it was kind of nice to find that there was a real community of both readers and writers in science fiction. And that you hear from your readers, which so many writers don't ever hear from their readers. So that was all kind of a discovery.
In the Tombs of Atuan, you've got a female central character, and yet she certainly doesn't emerge as a liberated woman.
No, the Earthsea books as feminist literature are a total, complete bust from my own archetypes and from my own cultural upbringing. I couldn't go down deep and come up with a woman wizard. Maybe I'll learn to eventually, but when I wrote those, I couldn't do it. I wish I could have.
When I started writing, which was in the 1940s, and when I started publishing, which was in the 1960s, the sort of basic assumption about fiction was that men were at the center of it. In fantasy and science fiction, the heroes were all male. There really were no female heroes. There were female characters, but they were secondary characters. They were marginal. Sometimes there were whole books with no women in them. And that is true of the first trilogy of Earthsea. Even Tombs of Atuan, which is all about women. But look at the women. Tanara is supposed to have all this power, but what is her power? She controls nothing. The world is actually being run by men, as it usually was.
So you have this really pretty masculine, pretty male-dominated world in the Earthsea trilogy. Just about everything in it, including the dragons, is male.
There's a famous bit in the first book where she mentions in passing that there's a saying, as weak as a woman's magic, and I think as wicked as a woman's magic, and this is just sort of thrown in there.
What I'd been doing as a writer was being a woman pretending to think like a man. I had to think, now why have I put men at the center of the books almost entirely? And the women are either marginal or in some way essentially dependent on the men. I started to write the fourth book in the series, Tahanu, and it just wouldn't go. I knew that Tanar didn't stay to learn from the great wizard. I knew she'd gone and married a farmer and had kids, but I didn't know why. And it took me 17 years to figure out why Tanar did that and what she was doing, what her way to go was. And during that time, that gap, a lot of things happened in my life, a lot of things happened in the world, naturally. Along comes the revival of feminism in the 70s. People start writing books saying, you know, where are women? Women are marginal in society and of course also in literature. But I was not part of it as a movement, partly because as a housewife and mother of 3 kids at home, I was not behaving the way a proper feminist should. There was a considerable feeling that we needed to cut loose from marriage, from men, and from motherhood. And there was no way I was going to do that. So I felt a little defensive for a long time in the 70s. And it was kind of only as I began getting more confidence in who I was, I began to feel more at home in it as a movement. Of course I can write novels with one hand and bring up 3 kids with the other. Yeah, sure, watch me. There's a lot of pride and self-respect involved. I can do it. I will do it, by God.
The modern feminist movement had just sort of hit science fiction. And some people embraced it and some people were pretty upset about it. There was a big argument about, whether there was room for women in science fiction. And they meant as readers, as writers, and as characters.
It was almost like taking a cork out of a bottle of champagne that you'd just shaken up. There was a kind of explosion of ideas and opinions that had been bottled up for a while.
By the way, I want to state that I think Ernest Hemingway was unjust and full of shit. So I kind of had to rethink my entire approach to writing fiction. I learned to read other women's writings. It was important to think about privilege and power and domination in terms of gender which was something that fantasy had not done. After letting Terramar sit on the shelf for all those years because I didn't know what to do with her, I found that I was ready to go on with her story. And that's what finally led me to writing Tahanu. All I changed is the point of view. All of a sudden, we are seeing Earthsea not from the point of view of the powerful, but from the point of view of the powerless.
And you read it and you go, okay, everything that she said in the first 3 books is true, but it wasn't the whole picture.
Earthsea becomes less magic, becomes a colder, harder, grittier, earthier place. There is child abuse there. It's not really feeling like a fantasy world, and it perhaps mirrors your own process of growth as a human being.
We can see Le Guin growing in front of our eyes, examining the constructs of gender in Earthsea, the world that she herself created. You can feel a kind of simmering rage, a simmering rage at injustice.
It was a very interesting book to write, not an easy one. The way I handled it upset many of my older readers, particularly men, because they saw it as a feminist statement and they were alarmed. They perceived it as a kind of betrayal because my hero, dead, had lost his power. And a male hero that has lost his power is degraded in some people's eyes. It was a radical revision from within of my whole enterprise in writing. And for a while, I thought it was going to kind of silence me. But I think if I hadn't gone through with it and learned how to write from my own being as a woman, I probably would have stopped writing.
Come on now, catch up over there. Okay. Now let's see if it works.
I didn't even know that my father actually read her manuscripts until, relatively recently, that he's generally the first person who reads whatever she writes.
Mostly you just sort of say, that's good, which is what I want to hear.
I do remember very animated conversations, where we would say, don't argue with each other. And they would say, we're not arguing, we're just discussing.
Yes, we got
it published.
About the time we were sort of emerging from doing our homework and getting hungry, they would be sitting on either side of the fireplace, as they do to this day.
And that went fine, too.
I got a Fulbright scholarship to go to France. I was doing French history. And that's how we met, because she had one too. I think there were like 20 grantees going to France that year, and we were all put in steerage.
And at the end of dinner, I said, would anybody like to go to the bar and have an after-dinner drink? And there was this great silence among all these young kids, And this little voice said, yes.
I thought she was interesting. She was bright and articulate, and she seemed very sophisticated. She knew what to order. I didn't.
I thought he was really good company and really handsome and not like anybody I'd ever met, partly because he was Southern, I think, and I had known Southerners. So I would say I was in love by the third night out. Then when we came back to Paris and got married, we didn't have to go anywhere for our honeymoon. We were there. Perfect.
We lived in a little hotel the whole year.
I tell you, we were kings and queens that year.
10 months or so we were there.
We met at sea We married in a foreign language. What wonder if we cross a continent on foot each time to find each other at secret borders, bringing all my streams and darknesses of gold, and your deep graves and islands, a feather, a flake of mica, a willow leaf. That is our country, ours alone. My mother died in 1980. My children were all out of the house by then. It just was time for me to come home somehow. We just moved down here in January and stayed a whole spring here. The only time I lived here for week after week after week, except those summers of my childhood. I had to look around for a long time, circle like a turkey vulture, gradually narrowing until I realized what I wanted to write about was here, my place. Above all places, this is mine. This is sort of the center. When I'm up here, I think about my father and my mother and us when we were kids. This place is full of presences for me.
Maybe her magnum opus, although it's not her easiest book, is Always Coming Home, which is a book set in the world of her family's summer house in the Napa Valley.
It started with the idea of writing a utopia, but a different kind of utopia. Utopia that wasn't a kind of political blueprint. It's sort of an ecological utopia. It's an imagination of this beautiful valley being beautifully used by its human population. Pre-white California was, to a small extent, a model for Always Coming Home. A lot of those Californian people seem to have been very settled in rather more peace and quiet than a lot of people's. It was entirely a process of imaginative exploration. There was that sense of living in two worlds, and that their voices were around me sometimes. And that the poems would come as if I just write them down, as if I'd been told that.
Always Coming Home is barely a novel as we understand it.
It's a grab bag, a bag of scraps and pieces. And I had a kind of conviction that this was a good way to write a book.
One of the incredibly exciting things about Le Guin's fiction is that it's radically experimental. She gives us all these forms, all these different ways of thinking about fiction itself. And it's a kind of freedom that she gives to other writers. It's as though she says, look, I got away with it. If I got away with it, maybe you can get away with it too.
In the 90s and in the early noughties, it really felt like a new book from her every year, and it was like she just was on fire again. We're seeing the same themes that we know and love about alien worlds and dealing with issues around feminist identity, but everything is much more shaded in gray than ever before.
Style becomes more autumnal. The later work, it haunts you in more subtle ways and more nuanced ways. Truth is a muddy thing now. What if you aren't a wizard? What if you can't fix things by a spell? What if the only language you've got is the language of compromise, of mess, of misunderstanding?
But the fact of the matter is, there was nobody who was moving as brilliantly from genre to genre as Ursula K. Le Guin.
So what's happened most recently is the broadening of Le Guin's audience and readership. She's being recognized not just as one of our great science fiction and fantasy writers, but one of our great American writers.
As a giant of literature who is finally getting recognized, I take enormous pleasure in awarding the 2014 Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters to Ursula K. Le Guin.
All too often, people who are writers and artists who are marginalized and or radical are basically ignored or mocked or denigrated for a long time and then pass directly from there to being national treasures. Essentially, you go from outsider to full domestication. And one of the things that's so wonderful about Le Guin is that she would not and will not allow that to happen.
I rejoice in accepting it for and sharing it with all the writers who were excluded from literature for so long, my fellow authors of fantasy and science fiction.
This is why the speech that she gave when she won the sort of Lifetime Achievement Welcome to the Canon Award, to give it its invisible subtitle, was that it was, you know, a perfectly courteous but full-on swinging attack on the undermining of art and aesthetics for profit within the publishing industry.
Books, you know, they're not just commodities. The profit motive is often in conflict with the aims of art. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings.
I was there giving her the medal for literature, and which was one of the hugest honors of my life. And then going and sitting down and listening as Ursula took apart primarily Amazon.com in front of an audience of booksellers, many of whom were there from Amazon.com, who were also bankrolling the evening.
I was so scared before I gave that speech. It was awful. I was not saying what they expected the old lady from Oregon to say. I have had a long career and a good one, in good company. Now here, at the end of it, I really don't want to watch American literature get sold down the river. Well, a writer can certainly choose to simply serve capitalism and put their writing entirely in the service of success and making money. That's a legitimate choice. But it's not a choice that all writers want to make, thank goodness, because there are more interesting choices to make that are of more general good to more people.
That took an immense amount of guts. The same amount of guts that Ursula has shown time and time again, just addressing subjects that are not to be spoken of.
We don't have very many of these in this country, but she is a public intellectual. She has spoken out on behalf of artistic freedom for other writers. She has spoken out against systems of government that repress public discourse. She has been a consistent voice for the human spirit.
I guess I've always had a kind of long-term hope and short-term terror. We don't have to keep the doors shut. We could live in a different way than we do.
In the last 10 years, Ursula has wielded her status, which is considerable, very, very skillfully, and very, very much like a warrior. One reaches a certain age where you can just kind of sit back and let them have it.
And I don't offer any 10 easy steps to fame and fortune as an author. because I know that in art there are no easy steps. To learn to make something well can take your whole life, and it's worth it. That'll do, I think. So, shall we do Q&A? The big thing that has happened to both fantasy and science fiction in my lifetime is that they have come all the way out of that genre closet that they were forced into and are recognized as literature.
You now have a generation that grew up that doesn't quite understand why these artificial divisions ever existed.
Le Guin was ahead of her time, and we needed to catch back up to her.
The only question that should matter is this any good or not? I read A Wizard of Earthsea, and just things rearranged in my head. That's when I powerfully, hungrily, more than anything else I'd ever felt, wanted to be a writer.
You cannot deny Ursula Le Guin's influence on writers now of all kinds. And I think that, in the final analysis, is much more important than whether she was being reviewed as she should have been reviewed in 1975. Because she was being read by the people who would grow up to change opinions and change the world.
It's certainly a remarkable writer who can meet you when you're 10 years old and give you something wonderful to read and still be there for you when you're 45 years old and everywhere in between. I think she's one of the greatest writers that the 20th century American literary scene produced.
It's like that famous Earth shot called Earthrise, where we see our Earth just rising over the moon, this little blue fragile circle. Ursula's usage of science fiction, I feel, is to make these Earthrise photographs so we can, perhaps for the first time, see our world from a different perspective. If a world is dreamable, maybe it can be dreamed into being.
When I take you to the valley, you'll see the blue hills on the left and the blue hills on the right, the rainbow and the vineyards under the rainbow late in the rainy season. And maybe you'll say, there it is, that's it. But I'll say a little farther. We'll go on, I hope, and you'll see the roofs of the little towns and the hillsides yellow with wild oats. And maybe you'll say, let's stop here, this is it. But I'll say a little farther yet. We'll go on, and you'll hear the quail calling on the mountain by the springs of the river. And looking back, you'll see the river running downward through the wild hills behind, below, and you'll say, isn't that it, the valley? And all I'll be able to say is, drink this water of the spring, rest here a while. We have a long way yet to go, and I can't go without you.